I would say it's probably more important today than at least at any other time in my life to really affirm this statement that we are born to flourish. And it also is a hopeful message, but it's not vacuous hope. It's actually hope that is grounded in practice and in science. There is a growing body of scientific literature that speaks to this issue. And one of the ways that scientists have discovered that we're born to flourish is by looking at very, very young babies before our young ones have had the conditioning of their cultures and society. And in that early period, in the first 6 months of life, the evidence clearly suggests that babies have an innate propensity to be kind. And this is part of the qualities that enable human flourishing to emerge.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Dharma Lab. I am Cortland Dahl. I'm joined by Dr. Richard Davidson, who nobody incidentally calls Dr. Richard Davidson. We all know him affectionately as Richie. And we are today going to discuss one of the key topics in a new book that we are just about to publish in a few months. Actually, the title of the book, which is Born to Flourish. And before we dive in, we'll, of course, as we always do, we'll hear a little bit about the science. We'll hear about some important meditative principles that underlie this idea that we're born to flourish, that we all have innate capacities to flourish. And we'll also discuss some very practical tips, the kind of things you can build into your daily routine to tap into this potential we all have. But before we get there, I wanted just to share a little story, a little tidbit from my own life that brought this to life for me, which was an experience I had with my son when he was very little. My son, CJ, is 20 years old now. He's in college. But when he was a little kid, I had this routine with him where we would actually meditate together. It started when he was 3 years old. And I'd love to say I was a masterful meditation teacher with my son, but it was the vast majority of it was trial and error, probably a 99% error rate, but there was a few things that really resonated with him. And one in particular will always stick with me. So I had this idea that he should just see me meditating. And so I started shifting my meditation practice in the evening to doing it at the foot of his bed. So I would read him his nighttime story. And then I would just tell him, I'd say, okay, you go to sleep, don't pay attention to me. And I'm just going to sit here and do my meditation practice. It was kind of like reverse psychology because I knew he, of course, would want to pay attention. But occasionally he would perk up and he would ask me questions. I would say things from time to time about compassion or, awareness or what I was doing. And he would just ask me little questions. And there was one time where I was reminded of this principle from Buddhism called Buddha nature. The idea is that our true nature is fundamentally pure and whole and good, that we're kind of all Buddhas by nature. We just need to learn to recognize that. So I remembered that, and I had said something, or actually he had said something that sparked that memory. And I said that to him. I said, you're actually a Buddha. You have Buddha nature. That's who you are. And he was like 3. Of course, he doesn't understand what that means. But there was something in that it just brought this joyous response out of him. He started giggling. And I remember he was literally like rolling around in his bed and like laughing. And it just sparked this moment of joy. And it always has struck with me because there's something in us that we want the wholeness and the goodness in us to be seen. And we want to see it for ourselves. And the book that we've written together is really all about that. It's about these innate capacities. It's what they are. It's how we can get in touch with them. And this is just obviously so desperately needed in a world where we all feel broken and the world feels broken. We need to find a way back to the part that isn't broken. So Richie, that's just an opening story. I'll always remember that. It's one of my sweetest memories with my son.
Beautiful story. I love that story.
Yeah, I'll never forget
I
that.
start giggling when you talk about kids
It was. I mean,
living
honestly, I
without
have like
laughing.
goosebumps even remembering that. It was the sweetest. His response, it was just so precious, and he was so little and darling. And anyway, but let's just like let me. Yeah, why don't I just kick it over to you, and we can free associate a bit here. But
Yeah.
where would you
Well,
like to kick this off?
I remember when we were noodling around the title of the book and landing on Born to Flourish. And in many ways, it's a kind of radical statement, particularly in today's world. I've heard many people say, well, how can you say something like that when the world is falling apart? And people say there's such evidence for violence and hatred and divisiveness and polarization. How can we say that we're born to flourish? I would say it's probably more important today than at least at any other time in my life to really affirm this statement that we are born to flourish. And it also is a hopeful message, but it's not vacuous hope. It's actually hope that is grounded in practice and in science. And so, in terms of the science, there is a growing body of scientific literature that speaks to this issue. And one of the ways that scientists have discovered that we're born to flourish is by looking at very, very young babies. Before we've had the opportunity to mask these qualities before our young ones have had the conditioning of their cultures and society. And in that early period, in the first 6 months of life, the evidence clearly suggests that babies have an innate propensity to be kind. And this is part of the qualities that enable human flourishing to emerge. And so, just to give you an example of how this is done scientifically, there have been experiments done with 6-month-old babies where basically a baby is held on his or her mom's lap. That's how these experiments are done. And the baby is facing outward, and the baby is shown, in one case, for example, puppets that are playing together. And it's engaging for a 6-month-old infant to look at a puppet interaction. And in one case, the puppets are behaving with kindness. And so the way this scenario works is one puppet is trying to get a toy out of a box, and the cover of the box is very heavy. And, the puppet is lifting it and lifting it. Another puppet comes by and helps this first puppet to lift the cover and retrieve this really cool looking toy. And in another scenario, the same puppets are playing together, but and the first puppet is trying to open the box, and another puppet comes around and slams the box shut to ensure that the first puppet is unable to retrieve this cool looking toy. And so that's the kind of scenario that is depicted. And the question that is asked in these experiments is, which of these two scenarios do 6-month-old babies prefer? And of course, all you viewers should be thinking to yourself, well, how do you ask a 6-month-old baby which it prefers? And there are ways of doing that. So in the case of the puppets, one way to do that is the puppets are color coded. So in one case, the kind puppet is in one color and the mean puppet is in another color. And then the two puppets are held up to the kid, to the 6-month-old baby. And the question is, which one does the 6-month-old baby reach for? So that's a way for the 6-month-old infant to express its preference. And the results of these kinds of experiments are astounding. It's not like 65% of the infants prefer the kind puppet and 45% prefer the mean puppet. It's it in many of these experiments, it's 100% of
Mm.
the infants that show this preference.
Which is like unheard of in scientific research. You almost
Yeah,
never have
unheard
something
of.
that's like
Yeah.
so universal.
Just dramatic. You don't need to do statistics, because the results are so, absolutely crystal clear. And this is the kind of evidence that really is convincing and shows us that that we come into the world with this predisposition. Now, yes, we can learn all these negative things that mask these qualities, but our true nature, sort of our basic nature that underlies all of this, is one that is imbued, in this case, with kindness, which is one of the key elements that we know is essential for human flourishing.
Yeah, that maps perfectly onto the Buddhist view. As you know, Richie, the one of the most important themes that you find, especially in Buddhist psychology and Buddhist meditation, is this deep exploration of identity. And the thinking is that we often get stuck in these patterns that ultimately create and perpetuate our own suffering. We're just doing the same things over and over, not just doing the same things, but even thought patterns and the belief systems we carry around with us. And although we're unhappy or stressed out or burned out or whatever, we somehow find ourselves in these loops without any clear picture of how to get out of it. Well, the Buddhist analysis of that is that at the root of that is how we construct our identity, and usually a very basic misperception of who we are. So, like the terms you used very much resonate with this idea, because the idea is that it's our basic nature. We kind of misconstrue who and what we are. And out of that misconstrual and out of that basic belief structure that gets created, we have this whole dance of aversion and attachment and the push pull of experience that just creates all of these patterns, which are what cause our suffering. And if you look at like how, if you know, there's of course so much to say about this, but there's maybe at the simplest level, you could say, on the one hand, there are the things we normally equate with our sense of self. And then there's the blind spot. There's the stuff we don't really see. The things we usually equate our sense of self with are our history, our memories, our emotional patterns, our relationships, the roles we play in life, all of these things. And of course, this is part of who we are. It's not to say this is has nothing to do with our identity. But the key point that is diagnosed in these meditative traditions is that all of these things are changing. Our thoughts are changing, our relationships are changing, our roles. If you look from moment to moment, we play a role one moment, and then an hour later, it's something different. So all of this stuff, it's part of our experience, but it's changing. It's not kind of fundamental, and yet it's kind of like the flashy, bright objects of experience that our mind gets stuck on. And the blind spot is the stuff that's always there, the stuff that is not changing. So this kind of, as you were saying, Richie, awareness is the most basic thing. The fact that even in a moment of distraction, it might seem weird to say that you have awareness, but if I were to tap you on your shoulder in a moment of distraction and say, "Hey, Richie, what's going on? What are you doing?" You would be able to say, "Oh, I was just distracted." So there's some through line of awareness that's even in those distracted moments is still there. And from this point of view, you could say things like kindness, compassion, wisdom, that these are not things we need to cultivate. These are actually who we are. They're the more fundamental parts of who we are. And maybe you could speak to this, Richie, because the problem is actually the fact that they're ubiquitous. The blind spot in part is created because it's like the air we breathe. When something is there all the time, it's almost like our conscious awareness screens it out. It's almost like our mind is wired to notice the stuff that's different and that's aberrant rather than the stuff that's the baseline. So I don't know if that
Yeah,
I've
no,
used a
that's a
scientific
super
parallel from that too.
yeah. That's a super important issue. And one of the reasons why people often question our focus on flourishing and say, well, what about all the negative stuff is that they are fixated on the negative. And the reason why we get fixated on negative stuff, why media, for example, plays up negative kinds of events is because they're actually more rare. Rarer events capture our attention more than events or than processes which are more common, more continuous. And so, if you just look at opportunities in our daily lives for positive and negative emotion, um, even in situations that are challenging, there's a lot of activity during our day which is positive. We just tend not to notice it. We notice the negative stuff more because it's more surprising. It's less frequent, and our brains are contrast detectors. They
Hmm.
notice difference, and the negative qualities are more different than the positive qualities are because the positive qualities are really our nature, and they are more continuous, and so we tend not to notice them. Uh,
As,
and
as an example of that today, so there was this tragic shooting today in Minneapolis. I'm from Minneapolis, as you know, Richie, and yeah, it just struck home because it's very close to where I grew up, and Minneapolis has just had such a rough ride these past few years. And so everything that's happened today, I'm going to remember that one thing. I'm going to remember this kind of a horrific tragedy. But when I look at the course of the day, there's all these little moments of cooperation, moments of connection, just a million different little moments that I won't remember. I'll remember that one thing that stood out. And it's a
um,
perfect example. I'm going to remember it, one, because it was emotionally salient, we would say in scientific terms. It had like an emotional charge. And two, because it was different. It was something that doesn't happen every day. But it's so easy for attention to kind of naturally gravitate to those things. And even for memory, kind of when we reconstruct our storyline, like in this case, here's the story of my life today. It's just one day. But those are the things that will stand out. It's like, we could even talk about the peak end rule. It's like, some
yeah.
little blip on the radar. I'll remember that little blip. It's not necessarily the baseline. It's not what was going on most of the day, but I'll remember that little uptick.
Yeah, and, you mentioned the peak end rule, and let's explain that to our viewers. So this is a rule, if you will. There are very few rules or laws in psychology, but this really is one of them. And this was formulated by the late Daniel Kahneman. Danny was a psychologist, but won the Nobel Prize in economics. Um, and he passed away about a year ago. And he was actually a good friend of mine, someone for whom I have enormous respect. And he was the author of a major bestseller called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. So he devised this peak end rule. And basically, what the peak end rule is about is how we remember our experience. Um, and what the peak end rule says is that we tend to remember the things that are at the peak of an experience, and we remember what happens at the very end of our experience. And that's how we encode particularly emotional events. And so, the way you describe your day, the peak may have been this horrific shooting in um in Minneapolis, but so much else has occurred during the day. But that's when you go to consolidate your memory for the day, it's going to be dominated by what happened at the peak and also maybe what happened at the end. And so, it's helpful to think about that. And in this case, if you know that a peak occurred, which it was disturbing, you can actually more intentionally plan your end. Um, so that's a little bit of a kind of tip that is informed by modern science, and you can use one of many kind of contemplative practices at the end of your day to really change the way you encode the memory of the day.
Yeah. And this idea, I mean, it's saying something like born to flourish, or the idea of Buddha nature, to use kind of like a technical term for this, but the idea that our at our most basic fundamental level, actually there's good there. There's something wholesome there. It sounds like a nice idea. It sounds like a nice theory. It's not so helpful, however, as a theory and idea. It's much more helpful as something you can take as a jumping off point to explore and analyze experience, and something that you can taste, something that's more than just a concept or a belief. And one way to look at this is that in some respects, this is the most fundamental thing that we bring into our personal journey, our meditative journey, however we construe that, because there's kind of two ways that you could enter into the process of working on your mind and exploring your inner experience, as we do in meditation, for example. One way is with an orientation and a set of assumptions that is based on flaws and shortcomings. So, whether we think about this or not, the basic assumption is that there's something wrong. There's things we don't like about our experience, or we don't like about ourselves, or we don't like about the world, or about our relationships, but there's stuff that could be better, maybe a lot better. And then we do the practice basically as an endless process of trying to fix and improve what's going on. So in Buddhist terms, we call this the causal approach. And it's called that because at this most fundamental level, the path, the kind of the process you're going through is usually unconsciously viewed as a process of setting in place the causes and conditions for some better experience to happen in the future, whether that's awakening or it's just being more content or more happy or less stressed out. But in any case, the goal line is often the future. So that's kind of this causal approach. What this idea is encouraging, perhaps, or inviting us to consider at least, is a totally different paradigm in which the set of assumptions isn't that we're broken and we're going to fix something. The set of assumptions actually is that we're fundamentally whole, and we've just lost touch with that. And so the process, rather than fixing and improving, it's a process of exploration and discovering the part that was never broken, rather than an addiction to endlessly fixing things. And this is what we call, as you know, Richie, it's called the fruitional approach, because the fruition of the whole process, or the end point of the process, isn't in the future. It's actually here and now. And we're just learning to see and to recognize something that's always present. So again, it goes back to the idea of these qualities like awareness, compassion, and wisdom being innate. But that's not helpful as a belief system. Like, it doesn't help you really to believe that, other than it might get you to look and to explore. The ultimate arbiter here is your experience. Like, we need to actually look and explore and analyze and then see that for ourselves. And then actually it's a total game changer once we start to shift out of the problem mentality and into this it's already here type mentality.
Yeah, and one of the really interesting corollaries of this is that this kind of approach, I think, for most people, leads them to experience this as that it's actually easier than we often think,
Hmm.
because we are this way to begin with, and it's really about discovering this in ourselves, recognizing this, becoming more familiar with it. It's not about wrestling with our mind and trying to twist it in a different way. It's really just looking and discovering. And it's a very different orientation, and it's more gentle. And I think most people experience it as um, easier than they had imagined.
Yeah, it's one of the things you often hear is this phrase, it's so close we don't see it. It's so easy we don't believe it. We think it's got to be more complicated than this. And sometimes when you do finally have an experiential taste, there's this feeling of like, oh my God, like, how did I not realize this? It's like been right here. And it's like it's just out of focus or just on the periphery of vision. And we somehow just never tuned into it. So yeah, so that's so apropos of the path, and the challenge of it, strangely, is that it's almost so easy that we just make it more complicated. We're like looking for something much more flashy when it's really this profound ordinariness in a sense. So maybe we could round this out with a more practical side of this, because this has been, I know, at the center of your practice and my practice and a lot of what we have kind of worked with in our own lives. Why don't we just maybe explore a little bit of how we bring this into our day, into our own meditative journey? What have you found helpful when it comes to actually bringing this out of the realm of theory and into your life?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important part of my life, and so there are many different ways. So, for example, today I had the opportunity to meet, a new person that I had never met before, the dean of the School of Business here at the University of Wisconsin, and I wanted to meet him. And in my morning meditation practice, I have this ritual after I meditate. I go through my calendar and just, in a very, very short period of time, just reflect on meetings that I have upcoming and just bring the person I'm meeting with into my mind and my heart and just reflect on how I could be most helpful in that meeting, and also appreciate uh, who this person is, and then I find when I meet them, and this is something that happened today, really at the very first moment of meeting, recognizing that here is a person who is just like me, that has Buddha nature and has all these qualities within himself. And part of why I'm here doing what I'm doing is so that I could show up in a way that is most appreciative of his Buddha nature, of his innate capacity to flourish, and that would lead to the most productive kind of interaction. And it was a great meeting, and I really had this very palpable sense of connection. Um, and that's one of many examples. Other examples are eating. This is, I always use a practice around eating. We eat several times a day. It's a great opportunity to simply appreciate all the people that contributed to having food on the plate and reflecting on how they're just like me in having these same qualities. And it's a real motivation for our practice that we can practice in order to be as helpful as we can to help others discover their true nature, just like we're trying to discover our true nature. And it really comes alive when you are interacting with people in this way.
Yeah, I love that. And you use this phrase, just like me, which is a whole practice unto itself. And it's something that I find super helpful as well, especially in moments where I or somebody else might be a little on the neurotic side, because it's so easy to get fixated on like the more toxic elements of experience. And I've found that practice in particular so helpful, because in that moment, just remembering, oh, like, just like me, this person wants to be happy. Just like me, this person doesn't want to suffer. And just like me, even though we don't want to suffer, and even though we all want to be happy, we still kind of get totally off the rails sometime. We still do things that aren't so kind sometimes. Like, none of us is perfect. No matter, even though we kind of share these basic impulses, we're all kind of doing this human thing and making mistakes and self-correcting. So I think, to me, it kind of brings in kind of a common humanity, just like, okay, none of us are perfect. It doesn't excuse, I mean, if somebody's doing something harmful, or doesn't rationalize that, but it brings a sense of common humanity back into it. And I find, like, my mind is just more grounded and balanced when I reconnect with that. And like you, I think the relational part of it is super helpful. So another thing that I think I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but one thing I love to do that I find very helpful is it's almost like seeing the Buddha nature, since we've been using that term, almost seeing that in the other person, like I did with CJ in that moment, just kind of viewing him that way. And again, it's not like this abstract principle. It means very specific things. So seeing that, oh, this person has this open, expansive awareness that we all have and that we all completely lose touch with. This person has the seeds of kindness and compassion. They want to be happy and they want to be free from suffering. Again, just like me. They have this incredible wisdom. Like, look at, all the things that they manifest in their lives. And so just, you don't even need to think that, but it's almost just bringing to mind this more expansive view of humanity and this potential we have. And then just seeing it in the person who's right in front of me. And I find two things happen in that. One is that it definitely shifts something in the relationship. You can feel kind of like you described in meeting with the dean of the business school. Something changes, like in the way you're relating to people. In fact, I think we're going to discuss the idea that flourishing is contagious. So that we'll kind of get into this in a subsequent session. But in any case, it shifts the dynamic. But secondarily, it almost as though it rebounds and kind of reverberates back to me. So when I'm seeing that in somebody else, it's almost like it creates this little loop where suddenly I see it more in myself, and then it's easier to see it in them. And then it kind of is in this very positive way, sort of building on itself. So yeah, relationships are clearly one very, very positive way to do it. What about maybe the last thing? How do you work with this in your more formal meditation practice?
Yeah, there are certainly practices that I do remind me of our nature, and the kind of just like me practice that you were describing is actually something that is taught in the Joy of Living curriculum. There are times when I will do that very explicitly. And then there are certain other kinds of practices that are more complicated in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, that are practices that really remind us of our true nature, and they're accompanied by reflections, and those are practices that really have affected me deeply, that I come back to, and that spontaneously arise during the day when I'm interacting. Having the butt on the cushion and doing this formally is really helpful in creating the causes and conditions that allow them to spontaneously arise, particularly when there's friction during the day, and when this is really going to be important.
Yeah, I find that too. And I think for me, both in my formal meditation practice and equally throughout the day, a lot of it is just remembering the this this inner orientation, you might call it, and seeing how much of the time my default, and probably for all of humanity, the default is the opposite. The default is to just constantly be in this fixing mode where we're just seeing the flaws, seeing the imperfections, and we're just always trying to get things better. And we're fixing ourselves, we're fixing our relationships, we're fixing our partners, we're seeing all the flaws in the world. And then we just totally miss this basic orientation to the stuff that's already here. So for me, I think as much as anything, it's just clicking back into that. It's just remembering, it's noticing the kind of the orientation to the problems, and just kind of shifting back into like, let's not forget about everything else that I'm maybe not in touch with. And
Yeah,
of
and
course,
one other element here, and that is that when a person is engaged in a kind of behavior which seems like it's harmful to themselves or to others, the kind of practice that we do helps us to see them as being confused and maybe deluded, but not mean.
not fundamentally
Yeah, not
bad or
fundamental.
evil or anything like that.
Exactly. That their action may be evil, and their action may be something you want to condemn, but it arises because they're failing to appreciate their true nature.
Hmm.
And that engenders compassion. It really does. And, I find even for, public figures who I don't have to name, that engender, almost rage at times. But, then it really flips quickly to see that, wow, they are so confused. And it's so sad that that they're so disconnected from their underlying true nature, and that just immediately transforms the response into compassion.
Yeah, you can see the world is so in need of this perspective shift so we can start seeing the good in each other, even if we disagree, even if we're totally on other sides of the political divide or the religious divide or whatever the divides are, which there seem to be so many these days. We need to find a way to come back to common humanity and to something good and wholesome that is there in all of us. And I think what we're seeing here, and certainly what we talk about in our book, Born to Flourish, is the how of that. How do you actually do that as a practice? So again, it's not a new belief system. It's something that becomes how you actually see yourself and see others and see the world. So desperately needed in these times. Any final thoughts before as we round this one up?
No, I think this has been great, and I just want to echo what you said that particularly at this time, these really simple practices can be so helpful and turn down the volume and allow us to overcome these divides that seem so insurmountable.
Well, on that note, we will conclude this episode of Dharma Lab. We're going to have a series of discussions on the topics that we cover in our new book. I think the next one we're going to talk about is how flourishing is actually contagious, even at a biological level, strange as that might sound. But in any case, we hope you enjoyed this, and we look forward to seeing you soon on another episode of Dharma Lab. Take care.
Thank you.